Now, turning to our program, please welcome Edgar Lynn, Policy Advocate and Counsel for Protect Democracy, to introduce our speaker.
I have the honor to introduce the head of our organization, Ian Bassin, today. Ian is the co-founder and executive director of Protect Democracy. Protect Democracy is a cross-ideological nonprofit of progressives, moderates, and conservatives who work to prevent American democracy from declining into a more authoritarian form of government. Ian previously served as White House counsel, where he effectively handled the democracy portfolio before it was called that, which included ensuring that the White House and the executive branch officials complied with the laws, rules, and norms that protect the democratic nature of our government. He's written about democracy, law, and politics with the New York Times, Washington Post, The Atlantic, and other publications. Just last year, he was awarded the 2023 MacArthur Fellowship, or commonly known as the Genius Award, the Skoll Award for Social Innovation, and has repeatedly been named among the most influential people in Washington by the Washingtonian magazine. He has received his JD from Yale Law and clerked at the Ninth Circuit upon his graduation. Okay, that's mostly drawn on from his official bio from our website, but some of the most meaningful stuff about Ian isn't on the bio page or his resume, who he is as a person and as a human. Ian grew up in Manhattan, traveled across the country, and now lives in the Bay Area, where he coaches soccer and Little League Baseball at his kid's school. He's got a big personality and cares deeply and genuinely about the state of our democracy. So deeply that he is adamant that we go knock on doors tomorrow in the community so that he can learn from Wisconsinites directly about their hopes and dreams for our democracy. Or pull up a table outside of Pick and Save and talk to folks in Wisconsin winter. I'm still deciding if I want to join him, but he's my boss, so I'll probably say yes. With that, Ian Bassin.
Well, thank you all. It is a privilege to be here at the center of the democratic universe this year. More people on the planet Earth are going to vote in elections this year than any year in human history. And the epicenter is here in Wisconsin. So I'm especially happy to be here because it's nice to have the privilege of being able to speak to people who have such sway over my children's future. But it's also nice to be here because it's just nice. I went to the Bucks game last night, and the only warm sweatshirt I had was my New York Knicks sweatshirt. So I wore it, and I expected, as a New Yorker, to be hit with booze and beer cans and batteries. But as I was going through security, someone said, "You're from New York?" And I braced myself and said, "Yes." He said, "It's a great town." And I said, well, thanks. Milwaukee's a great town too. Patted me on the shoulder and I said, wow, really nice. I didn't get hit with any batteries or beer cans. The only thing I actually did get hit with was a flying hot brat that got shot out of one of those cannons, knocked me in the head, and Edgar and I enjoyed a Polish dog. So it's nice to be at such a nice place. The other reason I think also I'm especially happy to be here at Rotary is, we were just talking about this at our table, that our country is losing the kinds of collective spaces that make democracy work, the kinds of physical spaces where people can come together with people in their communities, talk across differences about the matters of the day, and shape our collective future. When Alexis de Tocqueville toured America in 1830, it was these spaces that he referred to as the beating habits of the heart of American democracy. Our Constitution, our statutes, our laws on the books, they can only go so far. Our democracy will only survive if we have spaces in which we can come together to self-govern as fellow citizens. And this is one of those traditional spaces in this country where we do it. There are few of them left, and that there's so many people here today gives me hope that our democracy will live to see not just another day, but brighter days ahead. So what I want to do is talk about the path that I think we need to take to get there, and start with a little bit of context about where we are globally, in the state of our democracy, some of the things that could be leading us to this particular crisis moment, and then possible ways that we can get out of this crisis and back on the pathway of perfecting our democracy, which has been our journey for the past 250 years. And then hopefully we can have some discussion about this and engage in this collective space, and you all can give me some wisdom from here about what more we can do to protect our democracy. So let me start with some context. We are living right now through what political scientists refer to as the recession of the third wave of democracy. So since democracy's modern advent in the late 18th, early 19th century, it has essentially risen and fallen in a series of waves. The first wave after the American and French revolutions rose, and then as we know, Napoleon taking over that wave crashed back to sea. The second wave after World War II, as the imperial powers receded and formerly colonized nations became independent and initially democratic. The year of Africa, 1960, a dozen new democratic nations, and then many of those fall backwards into dictatorships and authoritarian regimes. And then finally, the last quarter of the 20th century is the third wave of democracy, the biggest one yet, where democracy over the last 25 years of the 20th century spreads to its furthest reaches yet and peaks somewhere in the early aughts. And it plateaus and begins to go into reverse. This is Freedom House data showing the percentage of countries in the world with democratic government. But if you look at any one of the data sets that study democracy around the world, you will see the same dynamic, where democracy recedes and what rises in its place is what the political scientists Steve Levitsky and Lucien Way call competitive authoritarian regimes or hybrid authoritarian regimes. And they give it this name to distinguish it from non-democratic regimes in the 20th century. So typically when democracies died in the 20th century, and Levitsky was one of the co-authors of the book, How Democracies Die, when democracies died in the 20th century, typically they became one-party dictatorships. They eliminated democracy altogether. They banned competitive parties. They typically came to power through force, tanks rolling through the town square. But that's not what's been happening in the 21st century. In the 21st century, democracies have died from within, where people getting elected through the normal process achieve power, and then once in power, begin to pull the threads out from within and tilt the playing field until elections are no longer competitive, until checks and balances no longer can actually carry the day. And as this has been happening around the world, under our noses, it's been happening in the United States. Freedom House, which was established in 1947 in the wake of World War II to study freedom and democracy around the world, rates every country's quality of their democracy every year. For the last 15 years on their score, the United States has gone from a 94 out of 100 to an 83, which moves us from being among the world's leading democracies to on par with Mongolia, Romania, and Argentina. And as that has been happening, American attitudes towards democracy have been eroding as well. 30 years ago, only 1 in 16 Americans said they would favor army or military rule in this country. Today it's 1 in 5. And the bulk of that change is younger Americans. If you ask Americans to what extent they believe it is essential to live in a democracy, older Americans overwhelmingly think it is. Younger Americans are much more agnostic about answering that question. In fact, the stats in the United States now on these numbers are worse than they were in Poland before the rise of the illiberal Law and Justice Party in Poland in 2015. So why? Why is this happening? Well, I wish I could give you a definitive answer. Nobody knows for sure. But there are a number of theories that have been studied and that people are advocating as possible causes. And I want to just introduce us to some of those theories, and you can draw your own conclusions about which one you think is most dominant. But one of them is that Western democracy is simply not delivering the goods anymore. This is a famous graph known as the elephant graph by the economist Branko Milanovic at CUNY in New York. And what it shows is changes in income over the last 30 to 40 years around the world. And those people in the lowest 80% of income distribution, that's the body of the elephant going from the elephant's head to the left, have seen their incomes rise significantly as the world has globalized, as labor markets have been brought online in formerly developing nations, and people who had been living under $1, under $2 a day with access to global labor markets saw their incomes rise significantly. Angus Deaton won the Nobel Prize for describing this phenomenon in his book, The Great Escape. And then, of course, At the tip of the elephant's trunk, the wealthiest 1% in the world also saw their incomes go up. But where the elephant's trunk is scraping on the ground, the 80, 90th percentile of global income distribution, that's the middle class in most advanced democracies. And notice how stagnant they have been. And so one theory is that the middle class is the most influential grouping when it comes to what sort of government you're going to have. The middle class wants a monarchy, you're going to have a monarchy. If the middle class wants a proletarian revolution, you're going to get a proletarian revolution. And if the middle class is unsatisfied that everyone to the left and right of them on this chart is doing well and they're stuck in the same place, you're going to get a form of rebellion in Western Europe, in South American countries, here as well. There's been an update to this graph, but the most recent data a couple months ago no longer looks like an elephant. I was actually going to have one of my kids draw a picture. I think they might do it in aardvark. But you can see the same dynamic here, which is the wealthiest 1% no longer are all the way at the top, but still 80th to 90th percentiles doing much worse than any other income group in the distribution. So that's one theory. People are rebelling against a system that used to promise that you were going to do better than your parents' generation and no longer offers that promise. Second theory is what I like to call the atomization of modern society theory. And you get critiques on this from the left and the right. On the left, there's a book there by Bob Putnam and Shaylin Garrett called The Upswing that makes the argument that on a whole bunch of data sets, it shows that America was a very individualistic society 130 years ago during the Gilded Age. And we didn't really have a very functional democracy back then. The progressive and populist movements were responsive to failures in our system. But we became much more community-minded over the course of the 20th century, peaking in the middle of that graph at the top around 1960, when the Beatles sing Come Together. And Putnam actually does make some Beatles references in here, trying to explain that George Harrison, John, Ringo, and Paul had their finger on the pulse of our society. And Come Together was the peak of us feeling like we were all in the same boat. And then if you're a fan, you'll remember that George Harrison then writes I, Me, Mine in 1970, and we become individualistic again. Gordon Gekko hammering home that greed is good, and by the end of the 20th, beginning of the 21st century, we are an individualistic society again. And that is just not compatible with a democracy. Democracy only thrives when we feel a sense of common purpose, that we have a res publica, a shared set of common goods. Patrick Deneen on the right is a leader of a very right-wing movement called the post-liberals, and they blame liberalism itself. A lot of the same critiques that Putnam and Garrett offered, but they say liberalism itself lionizes the individual and is therefore incompatible with a democracy. And those people who criticize social media for atomizing us, I think we fall into this camp as well. This is what we were talking about at our table in terms of us all being in the same space. Too often, especially among rising generations, people don't share physical spaces like this. They share virtual spaces where they pick who they will follow, who they will listen to. They self-select into a homogenous group, and there's not a sense of shared purpose in navigating differences. Third major theory is the backlash to demographic change theory. Ta-Nehisi Coates, in his introduction to his book, We Were 8 Years of Power, makes a very powerful point that writing of Reconstruction in 1930, W.E.B. Du Bois wrote, if there was one thing that South Carolina feared more than bad Negro government, it was good Negro government. What he meant by that was that the white supremacist ideology of the antebellum South was that one race was inherently superior and one race was inherently inferior. And if you elected black legislators in South Carolina and they failed at the job, you would prove that the racists in the South were right. But if they governed just as effectively as before, in fact, actually were more effective because the old boys network in South Carolina was quite corrupt and the new black legislators were not, well, that would undercut the very foundational philosophy of the antebellum South. And that threatened the Southern way more than anything else. And Coates makes the point that whether you agree or disagree with Barack Obama's politics or his policies, he's every bit as normal a president and person as George W. Bush and Bill Clinton. And that was incredibly threatening to those who might still hold on to some of those ideologies about a superiority between the races. But there's an even more innocent explanation for fear of demographic change. And that is around the world, when people fear that a social status that they have achieved might be eroding, there is a backlash. You see this in countries around the world. Barbara Walters' book, How to Start, makes the point that this is one of the #1 predictors of social civil conflict is when a formerly powerful social group feels that it is now being forced to share power with rising other powers. Internationally, this is known as the Thucydides trap. And there's some research to suggest that that dynamic is playing out here in the United States. Studies of the 2016 election showed that one of the number one predictors for support for the winner of that election was fear of social status loss among populations that traditionally have had outsized power in our country, rural populations, male populations, white populations, now being forced to accommodate with other rising demographics. That was a number one predictor of support for the winner of the 2016 election. Regardless, though, of which of these theories you think may hold the most water, we are seeing these theories collectively produce a wave of autocrats in the 21st century that are working to dismantle democracies from within. How do they do that? We asked a board of sort of the nation's leading scholars on comparative politics in January 2017 if there was a pattern that you saw from the left in Venezuela and Latin American countries where authoritarianism tends to come from the left, or from the right in Eastern Europe or countries like Turkey where authoritarianism tends to come from the right. And what they said was absolutely. There is a playbook that you see all of these hybrid authoritarian regimes use around the world, and it looks like this. First, these regimes politicize independent institutions like the civil service, law enforcement, and eventually the military. Second, they spread disinformation from the government. Third, they aggrandize power in the hands of the executive and undermine checking institutions like legislatures, courts, the free press, the private sector. They quash dissent. They scapegoat and delegitimize vulnerable populations. Now, this has been the tyrant's favorite tool since antiquity, because if you can pit people against each other on the basis of race or religion or sexual orientation, it's easier to pick their pockets of money and power. Six, they corrupt elections. And finally, they incite violence. We've seen all of that play out in the United States in recent years. There's a particular risk that I think is worth highlighting in this room of what happens under autocratic regimes to business leaders. Because business leaders face unique threats. I want to talk briefly about two examples. In Poland, Leszek Czarnecki was one of the wealthiest and most successful businessmen in the country, having founded the Get Noble Bank, which he expanded to include holdings in finance, in real estate, in media, until the Law and Justice Party came to power in 2015. The Law and Justice Party is an illiberal party, authoritarian, curious. They viewed Czarnecki as a threat. Why? Maybe because under the prior government, he had had close ties with the prior government, was a leading businessman in the state, or maybe just because authoritarian regimes tend to view powerful private business interests as a threat because they represent an independent center of power in the state. And so when Law and Justice came to power, they began to go after Czarnecki's businesses. They trumped up regulatory retaliation against him. They brought a number of legal actions against him. They began a whisper campaign to undermine trust in his reputation. And although he tried to fight back with an enormous amount of resources at his disposal, the government's power was too strong. Ultimately, investors read the writing on the wall that the government was not going to allow him to compete fairly in the marketplace, and they did the logical economic thing. They withdrew their financial support, and it became untenable for him to remain in charge of his company. He resigned as CEO, and when his lawyers advised that he was likely to face personal criminal charges before kangaroo legal proceedings, he fled the country. He lost his businesses, and he lost his home country. Now, it's possible that the new government in Poland, Donald Tusk's government, that just overthrew Law and Justice in a democratic election, might be more favorable towards an open market and Czarnecki returning, but the damage has been done. Piero Codobia, similarly, one of the leading businessmen in Nicaragua, founding Grupo Con, which is a money transfer firm in Nicaragua, was a leading philanthropist, businessman, intellectual in the state. Daniel Ortega governed Nicaragua in the 1980s, returned to power in 2007 with a much firmer grip. And from 2007 on, began to consolidate authoritarian control over the country to the detriment, as Obia began to point out, of the state of the economy and Nicaraguan society writ large. He began to publicly call into question the fact that under Ortega, in his authoritarian form of government, the investment environment had soured, the export market for Nicaraguan products had soured, the unemployment rate had soared, and Ortega and his regime did not take kindly to that criticism. They retaliated forcefully against Obia, using similar tactics to the ones that I just talked about in Poland. Eventually, Ubilla was forced to flee for his safety. In 2023, while he was exiled in Guatemala, Nicaragua stripped him of his citizenship, raided his properties, and seized them all to become property of the state. And it is very well understood in Nicaragua that that was done to Ubilla to send a signal to everyone else in the business community to toe the party line. This has happened in all of the countries in which these hybrid authoritarian regimes have come to power, where in order to remain in business, you must be a supporter of the regime. Being successful in business and a supporter of the regime became one and the same. Your boss as CEO is no longer your board or your investors or your customers. Your boss is the governing party. So what might happen next? Well, if I knew that, I'd be in Las Vegas, not here. But we do have some patterns from around the world, which is in Hungary, Viktor Orban modeled the threat of autocrat 2.0 being much more serious than the threat of autocrat 1.0. Orban was the prime minister in Hungary from 1998 to 2002, governed relatively normally as a mainstream conservative, lost in 2002 and blamed it on fraud. Spent the years out of power building what he called, in his words, quote unquote, a central political force field around himself that will allow he or his allies to govern for 15 to 20 years. He returned to power in 2010 and has not relinquished it since over the course of 4 elections. I think we're looking at a similar dynamic potentially playing out in this country. What can be done about it? So as Edgar mentioned, we are a nonprofit organization. We're a nonpartisan organization. I've got people on my staff who work for Elizabeth Warren, working alongside people who work for Ted Cruz. If you want to come to a fun Thanksgiving, we have fun Thanksgiving dinners. We disagree about what the top marginal tax rate should be. We disagree about how to regulate healthcare or energy in this country, but we agree that the way to resolve those disagreements is through a peaceful process of deliberation, elections, debate, legislative votes, and checks and balances. And what we've tried to build at the organization is a plan for how we get back to a place where we all agree on that again. We think there's 3 things that broadly American democracy and the American community needs to be doing. First, we got to hold the ceiling up before it caves in. Right now, that means protecting a free and fair election in 2024. Second, we have to strengthen the guardrails that protect our liberal, and I mean this not in the American colloquial sense, left-leaning, but in the classic Enlightenment sense, liberal democratic form of government. And third, we've never had a perfect democracy in this country. We've always been moving in that direction. But most advanced democracies in the world have updated their systems in the last 150 years based on the lessons of experience and have leapfrogged us to have much more functional representative democracies than we have, and we need to catch up and make some of those changes. So what do I mean by that? So protecting a free and fair election in 2024, the good news is a lot of the hard work has already been done. So first, the Electoral Count Act, which is what Congress was following when it met on January 6, 2021, was a very ambiguous set of provisions from the late 1880s that needed to be updated. That was done. Our organization, working alongside others, worked with a bipartisan group of senators to hammer out a reform to that bill that was signed into law in December of 2022. Second, a very dangerous theory was floated to the Supreme Court that would have given state legislatures exclusive and plenary power over running elections in ways that took out of the picture courts, election officials, judges. That was defeated at the Supreme Court again through a cross-ideological group of conservatives and progressives and moderates joining together to talk about having a sensible system of checks and balances, what the Constitution demanded. And finally, those people who were running to oversee the 2024 election, who did not credit the legitimacy of the 2020 election, were defeated in battleground states across the board. But we're not out of the woods. There's a set of remaining risks. Disinformation is a corrosive impact on our democracy. We have got to deter disinformation and provide correctives to it. Our organization has been litigating against some people who spread false conspiracy theories in 2020. We just won a verdict on behalf of our incredibly brave clients, Ruby Freeman and Shay Moss, 2 election workers in Georgia who did nothing wrong and had their lives turned upside down by election lies. They won a $148 million verdict against Rudy Giuliani. And the idea behind that was not just to give a measure of justice to our clients, but to set a deterrent out there that we have freedom of speech in this country, but not freedom to lie and harm people with impunity. Second, there are a bunch of risks to the integrity of voter lists and to the ability of voters to cast ballots. And we and lots of other wonderful organizations, including the one that Sam Liebert here works for, All Voting is Local, going to make sure that people have the ability to cast their ballots without undue intrusions and still be able to do so in a secure way, so only people who are eligible are those who are able to vote. We need to make sure that people don't try to undermine the certification of the election. We need to be careful about the threat of violence and speak out against it. And finally, we have a problem that nobody has devised a solution to yet, but maybe this room can be part of the solution, which is no matter who wins the election in 2024, a significant portion of the country will not trust that that person was legitimately elected. You cannot maintain a democracy if that continues to be the case. In terms of Wisconsin, we are working on a number of things here to try to smooth the process, bills that would protect election workers, bills that would protect Wisconsin's electoral college votes when the final votes are tabulated in Washington, and bills that would make it more protective for whistleblowers within the electoral administration system to say something with protection if they see someone doing something they're not supposed to be doing within the system. Those bills are bipartisan bills that are making their way through the legislature here. And if you're looking for ways you can get involved, urging your elected officials to move those bills through is one, and my colleague Edgar Lynn can help you do that if you're interested. Objective 2, we got to mitigate the risk of autocratic rule in this country. What that means is an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. Whoever wins the presidency in 2024 should be someone committed to our democratic ideals. But if someone were to ascend to the presidency who isn't, we need to make sure that we are preparing now to survive that as a democracy, and that means protecting those who would be targeted with retaliation and making sure that the institutions of our democracy survive. And then finally, it is critical in a democracy that every 4 years we get to render a verdict on the governing party in power and get to choose freely whether we want to keep them or not. And we need to keep in mind protecting that in 2028 will become a central challenge. And then finally, we've got to get out of this cycle. We can't be living in a democracy where every election feels existential. And in this respect, the United States is a bit of an outlier. Because while I mentioned at the start that democracy is receding around the world, the way that is playing out is more extreme in the United States than some of our peer democracies. This again is data from the Variety of Democracies Institute, which is an institute that studies democracy around the world, based in Sweden. And what you see here is that as we've been through this democratic recession, the United States has fallen behind some of our peers. And it's worth asking why. And our organization did a deep dive into that. And what we discovered is that our electoral systems are actually designed to incentivize extremist behavior on both sides. And that's not the case in most of our peer democracies. The way that we structure how we run elections, who gets elected and who we choose, not the person or not the party, but the person who gets 51% in a bi-party system, means that those people who are most extreme and can capture the victory in an early primary can actually capture 51% of governing power. That's not how it works in most other countries. There are extreme factions in every advanced democracy in the world. Typically, they might be 7%, 8% of the population. At a high watermark, they might go to 15 or even 22, 23. The alternative for Germany, the AfD, which is the far-right neo-Nazi party in Germany, is now at about 26%. But here's what happens in those other countries. If an extremist group, the True Finns, the far-right Swedish movement, come to power, they have to govern in coalition with the mainstream party on the mainstream right or the mainstream left. And they get stuck in a bind. Because if they join that coalition and they moderate their views from the extremist views that won them support, they lose their supporters the next election. If they don't moderate their views, then the mainstream governing partner kicks them out of the coalition. And it's a natural check on extremism that doesn't operate in our system. But we can change that. We're working on a number of reforms to create a dynamic that incentivizes moderation, cooperation, and compromise. Just to name a couple, fusion voting was the standard way that politics worked in the United States in the 19th century. It meant that minor parties would fuse with a major party to elect a candidate who they supported based on his platform. So the Free Soil Party was for not expanding slavery into the territories. The Liberty Party was for abolishing slavery in the South. The Know Nothing Party was an anti-immigrant party that didn't want to compete with labor in the South. But what they all did as small parties was they fused with the Whigs when the Whigs nominated anti-slavery candidates in the North, like Salmon Chase in Ohio, Charles Sumner in Massachusetts, and eventually all those little parties met here in Ripon, Wisconsin, and formed the Republican Party. That was the birth of the Republican Party, came out of fusion. But then the Republicans in the North and Democrats in the South didn't like fusion anymore, so they banned it across the country. You cannot do that anymore. A minor party, if it were to form today, could only nominate its own candidate that would play a spoiler role. It can't cross-nominate a major party candidate. We want to make that legal again. It would allow for people in the center to form a party and hold out their vote for either of the major parties nominating someone that they supported that was pro-democracy, pro-truth, and that they thought they could lend some support to. Proportional representation is what these other countries, advanced democracies, do. We want to experiment more with that in this country. And finally, our political parties are broken, both of them. And political parties are necessary for a democracy, and we need to strengthen our political parties again. Finally, culture eats policy for breakfast. And no matter what laws or constitutions we have, as Tocqueville pointed out, if we don't make sure that the habits of our heart are healthy and that we are behaving as a democratic people, ultimately, no matter what laws we enact, they will not carry the day. So we need to reinvest in civic education and training. We need to reinvest in building collective settings like this one. And the people in this room need to engage in modeling democratic behavior as institutional pillars in your communities. So what else can you do? Reinforce the stakes for our democracy. People look to you all as people who come to events like this to be engaged in civic affairs. Have an opinion that's worth listening to. Go out there and remind people not just the stakes for our democracy, but the values of democracy that matter. We are losing touch with those as a society. Create spaces for your workforces to participate in democracy, either as poll workers or at least to be able to easily go out and vote. Model being a bridge builder and a statesperson. And try to persuade others that this is not a moment to sit on the sidelines. Edgar mentioned that I coach soccer and Little League baseball. I have a 3-year-old and a 7-year-old. My 7-year-old was born on January 17th, 2017, before our version of a hybrid autocratic regime took power. I took it upon myself then to make a promise to him when he was born that I would hand his generation a stronger democracy than I inherited. I am living and we are living in one of the rare moments in history where we will dictate the future 100 years of global civilization. It is not a moment to sit on the sidelines. I'm grateful you've invited me to speak. I would love to talk more about this and take questions. And I hope what you take away from this is that this is a time not to step back, but to step up for our democracy. Thank you. Aaron's got a microphone right here, so if anyone has either a question or we'll take also comments and thoughts on things that we can do as well, please just maybe come up to the room. And if you wouldn't mind just introducing yourselves before you ask, that would be great.
Hi, my name is Kyle. Thanks for being here today. I'm just curious. I think a lot of people are disenfranchised on both sides. And I know it's very difficult and challenging, but because we're in a really somewhat of a unique time, is there actually a really good lane for a third party? You know, one that sort of comes down the middle, because I think a lot of Americans still are in that middle lane, but they're not seeing that represented. Is that a possibility? Is anybody looking at that?
Thanks, Kyle. Yeah, I think it is really important, and there is a real problem is the current rules and structures don't allow it to happen in a way that is productive as opposed to destructive. So today, if there were a third party, either candidate or a party running on the ballot, they would play the role of spoiler. They have no pathway to actually win because of the hammerlock that the two major parties have on our system. But what they can do is they can ensure that someone wins with just a plurality as opposed to a majority. They could deprive a majority of actually carrying the day, which is why we're advocating for re-legalizing fusion voting, because it would provide a pathway for a third party to form, build support and power, and force the other parties to come and meet the demands of the third party. So for example, in New Jersey, in the New Jersey 7th district, 2 candidates were running in 2022. One is a fairly moderate Democrat, one is a fairly far-right Republican, and a bunch of Republicans in the district said, I don't really want to vote for the far-right Republican on my party line. I'd rather vote for the moderate Democrat, but I'm not a Democrat, and I'm not going to pull the lever for the Democratic Party because I don't believe in it. It's not how I identify. So they formed something called the Moderate Party, and they were a bunch of conservative Republicans who believed in mainline traditional Republican thinking and wanted to nominate the Democratic candidate, but on their party line. So people could say to that candidate, I'm going to vote for you, but I'm voting for you as a centrist, as a moderate, as a conservative. I want you to govern in that way because I'm bringing 50,000 votes, and so I want a seat at your table. But they were not allowed to do that in New Jersey because that's fusion voting, and that's illegal. So we represent them in a lawsuit in the New Jersey State Court saying that violates the right to freedom of association. They should be entitled to endorse whoever they want to endorse. And if they were able to do that, you would actually create an opportunity for third parties to form, as happened in the 19th century, and bargain with the major parties to form coalitions. And that's a little bit like what happens in other advanced democracies that have more coalition forms of government, but it will allow people to form an identity, have a set of policy priorities, and offer those in exchange for an endorsement. It would be a healthy way of bringing third parties into the system. It's not legal in Wisconsin right now. We're exploring the possibility of trying to challenge that in future cycles in Wisconsin, and that would be, we think, a healthy way of addressing, as Kyle notes, the very real desire for choices beyond the two-party system. But until we have a system like that, right now third parties are just playing spoilers, I think are quite dangerous in the system because they would deny a majority the ability of actually directing the outcome of an election.
My name is John Franke. At the core of British and then later American conservatism was a fundamental belief in institutions and respect for institutions, whether they deserved it or not, flawed or not. A staggering number of my fellow citizens apparently believe that critical government institutions, our election system, our system of justice, are not just flawed, but fundamentally corrupt, fundamentally untrustworthy. Putting aside where that came from, whose fault it is, does Protect Democracy have any ideas as to how you change that trajectory?
Yeah, John, thanks. It's a great question. I am a fan of one Edmund Burke line, the sort of line of English conservatism, which is, I learned that the only thing it takes for evil to flourish is good people to do nothing. And so I would urge us to heed Burke on that point today. But yes, we have a fundamental lack of trust in our institutions, and it's not just in the United States. If you look at some of the rebellions against the European Union, you see some of the same dynamics there about sort of lack of trust in the European Commission, European Union, viewing it as a corrupt body, and seeing that that's driving some of the both far right and far left sentiment on the continent. And I think I mention it because they have something in common, which is that as government gets further and further away from the citizenry, it's harder and harder to maintain those bonds of trust. So the founding fathers thought that the average size of a House district should be about 40 to 50,000 voters. And the insight was that that's about as big as a representative district can be and still maintain some fundamental connection, excuse me, between the voters and their representative. And in fact, Madison and Washington wanted the First Amendment to the Constitution to lock in that ratio. We all know the First Amendment, they lost that battle. But nevertheless, after 1789, every 10 years, when there was the decennial census, and we saw that the American population was growing, oh, thank you very much, Congress expanded the size of the House of Representatives to maintain roughly that ratio of 50, 60, 70,000 voters until 1911. 1911 was the last time that Congress expanded the size of the House of Representatives, and what happened around 1911 was that the South started to realize that because most population growth was happening in urban centers in the North, if this continued to happen, they would disproportionately lose power. And so they filibustered the expansion of the House in 1911. The House has never been expanded since, even though the population has doubled since then. So today, the average House district has upwards of 750,000, sometimes a million voters in it, which creates a number of problems. One, instead of being 1 degree removed from your House member at about a 50,000 person district, you're now 2-3 degrees removed or more, which is going to inherently sow distrust. You don't know that. That's not, oh, that's John's cousin Betsy. It's not John's cousin Betsy anymore, right? And then second, if you want to win an election in a race with 50,000 people, you can meet a good chunk of them. If you want to win a race in a district with 1 million, you have to spend a lot of money. So now campaign finance becomes a dominant aspect of what's happening. So there's a bunch of structural things, John, that I think could be changed. So I say all that to say, one of the things that we think we need to do is re-expand the House and get back to a place where House districts are smaller and people have a closer connection to the representative in government. And then I think we need to work on retail government and making sure that people's experience. So I worked in New York City government. And I said to my boss at the time, I want everyone in New York City to have the experience when they engage with our government that I have when I go into like the Apple store, which is someone comes up and says, oh, can I help you? Come right over here. That's what it should be. And if you had that, that would foster trust in government as well. And that's a cultural issue in government and a cultural issue from leadership. So yes, I think there's a lot that we need to do on this issue because lack of trust in government is going to lead to failures in our democracy unless we find a way to address it. Thanks, John.
Thank you. Wonderful talk. I don't think I heard you say anything about gerrymandered districts. Have you looked into it, and do you have a recommendation to how to deal with both sides? Clearly do it. So do you have a recommendation as to how it can be resolved?
Yeah, so I didn't spend much time talking about one of the other reforms that we think is critical. Oh, there we go. Which is right under fusion voting, which I was just talking about. Is it says MMD and proportional representation, and that stands for multi-member districts and proportional representation. So we used to have around the country districts that were not one single representative representing the district, but multiple people did. So you'd have a district with 3 people representing it or 5 people representing it. Sometimes this was legislative districts, sometimes it was things like county boards. But what happened in the early part of the 20th century is, and this typically happened, well, it didn't just happen in the South, it happened in the North as well. You'd have 5 members of a board elected, all by majority vote. And if the district was 60% white and 40% black, then all 5 would win 60-40, and you'd have 5 white representatives in that district. So Congress, responding to this, said that doesn't seem fair. If 40% of the district is black and all 5 representatives are white, we're going to ban the use of these multi-member districts because it's being used in ways that are designed to disenfranchise black voters. So they passed a law in 1967 called the Uniform Congressional Districting Act to ban that practice. It's a well-motivated choice, but we think they had the wrong solution. If instead they had said, you can do that, have 5 people that represent the whole district, you just have to allocate them proportionally. So if the vote is 60-40, the 60 get 3 seats and the 40 get 2 seats. And if they had done that, we thought that would have not only solved the problem, but it would have solved the gerrymandering problem as well. Because today, as we know from the gerrymandering problem, not only is gerrymandering a problem, but you couldn't even necessarily gerrymander a state to actually represent the true constituencies of the state. So take Massachusetts, for example. I think Massachusetts has now about 11 House members. I might be off by 1 or so, all Democrats. Take Oklahoma, all Republicans. But everyone in Oklahoma is a Republican and everyone in Massachusetts is a Democrat. You got 30-40% Republicans in Massachusetts and 30-40% Democrats in Oklahoma that have no representation whatsoever. And a computer scientist tried to gerrymander Massachusetts to provide at least 1 seat for a Republican, couldn't do it because of the way the population is distributed. But if Massachusetts instead used multi-member districts, simply had 3 districts, each with 3 or 4 representatives that were allocated proportionally, then Republicans would get a couple seats in Massachusetts. And Democrats would get a couple of seats in Oklahoma. And those individuals representing the same constituents from different parties would have an incentive to work together. And people would feel, no matter who they voted for, someone represented them. So to John's question about trust, if I'm a Republican in California, of course I don't trust my government. I have no say in it. If I'm a Democrat in Oklahoma, of course I don't trust my government. I don't have a say in it. We think multi-member districts and proportional representation would not only solve some of the trust problems, but gerrymandering becomes irrelevant. You can't gerrymander a state where it's done that way. So yes, we think that that is the long-term solution. That is a bit of a moonshot to pull off in this country, but we've got a strategy over the next couple of years to try to do it locally first, build up support first in a state where it would advantage Republicans, in a state where it would advantage Democrats so that we de-partisanize the topic, have supporters on both sides of the aisle, and then ultimately try to build up to federal reform. Thank you.
I read recently that because of the existence of battleground states, one of which is Wisconsin, that less than 100,000 voters will determine who the next president is in this year's election. Is that typical of this democracy, autocracy, matrix dynamic that you describe, or is that unique to our country at this time?
Thank you. We're special. There are a lot of the dynamics I talked about where you can see parallels in other countries around the world, but that one is uniquely American. The Economist, the magazine, published a cover story about a month and a half ago talking about the stakes for the globe, saying that the greatest danger for the globe was the outcome of the US election in 2024. And the end of the article points out in the last paragraph that whether it's 100,000 or 300,000, basically the American election is going to be decided by 100 to 300,000 voters in a handful of states in the US, and that is going to determine the trajectory of the global future of the 21st century. And so here I am in Wisconsin.
This will be the last question for Ian.
Hi, my name is Dan. I was really struck by some of the data you showed. I never actually realized that democracy is less than half of the world's population is a form of government, and that was high watermark a few years ago. I also was really struck by some of the income and maybe quality of life indicators you shared. Is there any data on some of the other models besides democracy that would correlate to a higher quality of life, a better standard of living, better income distribution, or any of the other matrices that you shared?
So I'm a deep believer in always sort of questioning everything that you think and challenging it and making sure that you're kicking every tire. And so I think it's worth looking at, like the notion that democracy might be the worst form of government except for all the others is not really true. Generally speaking, on most of the research that I've seen, democracies do produce, generally speaking, higher self-stated satisfaction of quality of life, higher financial and economic benefits for the society. But there are counter arguments as well. So I taught American constitutional law a couple of years ago, and I was overseas teaching it, and so I had a student body that was made up of students from around the world, and one student from mainland China. And I was talking about the First Amendment, I was talking about American elections, American democracy, and I asked him to coffee. And I said, I'm just sort of curious, what do you make of all of this talk about elections and the First Amendment and free expression and free press? And he said, might work for you, wouldn't work for us. And what do you mean? He said, well, you guys are 330 million people. This is 2011. You're about to default on your own debt because you can't figure out how to get your stuff together. We're a billion people. Imagine what sort of chaos it would be for us. Our system works better for us. And that was 13 years ago. And every data point since has, I think, added to his argument, not mine. So I do think that it is worth wondering what are forms of government in the 21st century that we could improve upon democracy. I don't think we want a form of government that takes away our freedom, our agency, our autonomy to live the best life that we can try to live. Enlightenment theories about liberalism and democracy grew out of 100 years of religious wars in which people were tired of fighting and dying. And they wanted to create a system of government that allowed people to have their own version of the good life and stop fighting to impose their good life on someone else's. So I fundamentally think that we've got to find a system of government that honors that sense of self-determination, freedom, agency, and that democracy is the best we've come up with so far. But hopefully our kids will come up with a better one. We've just got to protect it enough to get them there.